Good evening, everyone. I hope everyone can hear me. I'd like to thank you all for coming on, listening to my webinar. My name is Dominic Robinson. I'm a member of the Plymouth Sound branch of the British Sub Aqua Club, and also, oh, someone's got their microphone on there. Please, if you could turn it off, that'd be appreciated.
Unknown participant is now joining.
Sorry, I was just saying there, my name is Dominic Robinson. I'm a member of the Plymouth Sound branch of the British Sub Aqua Club. I'm very fortunate that I also work, I train military divers, military recreational divers to dive at the Joint Service Sub Aqua Diving Centre. And this evening, I'm going to be talking to you about the ship, the SS East Point, and the many stories that surround it that I've found out about whilst looking into it. So, the first thing is to explain why the SS East Point, and that I'm sure many of you recognise is a chart of the area to the south of Plymouth, and to give you a bit of scale, that's the Eddystone Lighthouse there, about 12 miles off Plymouth, and that there is the location of the SS East Point. My first dive there was off a local hard boat with this group of people here, but subsequently we've been out there a number of times in our club ribs, and so I guess the first thing I'd like to do is just give you a bit of a feel for what diving a wreck like that is. It's a technical dive, so it's about 68 meters to the seabed, but because it's a technical dive, obviously that means it's a bit more intact than most wrecks, but also it's a lot darker down there as well. And I apologise for the poor quality of some of my photos. That's kind of typically what you'll see when you get to the bottom of a shot. You can see there's a bag there to lift the shot, the rope, there's a strobe above it, and a couple of divers in the murk. This one there, next photo, if you look very closely, you can see that the torch is shining on a blade of the propeller, and more about the prop later on. That there is also the stern. That's the steering quadrant. As you can see, actually stands very proud, and this was a sizable wreck, as I'll explain in a minute. And so that stands probably a good 7-8 meters, maybe more, off the seabed. There's another couple of photos of some divers, and you can probably see, although it is dark down there, that the visibility is pretty good. And if you've got a decent torch, then obviously you can see what you're doing. But the key thing with a dive like this, of course, is that you end up spending an awful lot of time doing that. Now, that wreck is no different from many of the other technical wrecks in the local area. So why particularly the SS East Point? Well, I'm going to attribute it to one particular thing, which is that cup there. And I found that the first time I dived on the East Point, and I picked it up. Obviously, it'd been down there over 100 years, still pretty intact, as you can see, with the shipping lines crest on it. And holding an object like that made me wonder about a bit about the wreck, how it got there, who were the people who'd been on that ship, and what were their experiences like. So I kind of, with that, I kind of thought, you know what, I'm going to find out a bit more. So there we go. You've seen that picture already. That is the East Point in its prime. I don't know when the photo was taken, but I suspect fairly early on in its life. She was quite a large ship and relatively fast. She was built in the famous Sunderland shipyards, where so many ships of that era were. Big, as I've already said there, so nearly 120 meters long, 15.5 meters wide. And she was actually built for the transatlantic trade and made the run over to America on many occasions. As you can see there, 3 boilers, fairly decent sized engine, and a single large propeller. Crew, depending on what she was doing, particularly in wartime, obviously they put additional crew on to man the armament. And the East Point was armed when it was sunk. It was with an old 4.7-inch naval gun, which had would have probably seen or probably been built prior to the Boer War, considered obsolete by the Navy, who put them in stores. And then when it became apparent they needed something to deter submarines, they fitted them to ships like the East Point. Lots and lots of ships got them. So there's the East Point. And what about her nemesis? Well, the East Point was sunk by the SM U48. Now SM is the equivalent of HMS. So back in those days, obviously the Kaiser still ruled Germany, so that's why they had the HMS equivalent. It was a Type U43 submarine, and it was commissioned in 1916. So you know, midway through the First World War, I guess. Now these are actual photos of the U48. I didn't have any last time I did this presentation, but I've managed to get these ones from the archive in Germany. So you're actually looking at the real pictures of the real submarine. One of a class of 9, so you can imagine the submarine's very new at this period, and they went through lots of evolutions, lots of different designs. They became obsolete very quickly. They came up with new submarines. So only 9 of these built, of which 2 were given to the Austrians, who used them in the Mediterranean. In terms of size, obviously a lot smaller than the East Point, but 65 meters long and 6.2 meters wide there. And once again, there's another photo of her, so you can see what she looks like. 2 diesel engines, 2 electric engines. Now, submarines of this era were not like modern submarines. They didn't spend that much time underwater. The battery technology wasn't up to it. So most of their time they were on the surface using the diesel engines to run and charge the batteries. And then when they sighted a target or they were under threat, they would obviously go underwater and either attack or hide. So had a maximum depth rating of 50 meters, so not particularly deep, but quite a large crew of 36. So I'm sure many people will have seen the movie Das Boot, and this submarine was about the same size, about the same number of people as the submarine depicted in that movie, which is obviously a Second World War one, but it does give you a feel for what it was like. In terms of armament, she was armed with 4 torpedo tubes with a total of 6 torpedoes, and accounts vary as to whether she had 1 or 2 guns. Now, obviously, the photos show her with 2 guns. There's a suggestion maybe that those were taken off before her. One of them was removed for its final voyage. And the preference for these submarines was to use the gun if at all possible. And the reason for that is obviously they only had a limited number of torpedoes, and they had more ammunition for the gun. Obviously, the problem with that, of course, is that you came to the surface, you exposed yourself. And as we've seen from the East Points, the Navy did start arming their ships. And obviously, the risk of submarine was that it could be attacked and sunk by a Navy ship. And the Navy operated things called Q ships, which were ships that was disguised as freighters, but actually had far more guns than normal. And they tried to take the submarines on in combat on the surface. So there's the U48, which sunk the East Point. So what I'm going to do now is just talk about the day that the East Point sunk, and a lot of this information has come from the records. So as you can see there, that is actually a scan of one of the documents in Q in the archive there. She was en route from London to Philadelphia, and doing a sort of 7.5 knots, and she got torpedoed between the number 2 and the number 3 hold, so forward of the bridge. And basically that was the first from the records that the crew knew about it. So and then the ship went down in 15 minutes. So from the perspective of the East Point, she was minding her own business, sailing along, got hit by a torpedo and sunk pretty quickly. They were lucky. All the survivors were recovered by nearby vessels, of which, according to the records, there seems to have been quite a few. Some Navy ones, some other cargo ships. What they did report, though, is after they'd been hit by the torpedo, they did see a periscope on the port side. As you can see, they're about 200 feet away. Other parts of the record show slightly different numbers, but all basically in that kind of ballpark. Now, one of the interesting things is that the ship wasn't zigzagging, and the standing orders were for all ships to sail a zigzag course at all times. As the master writes in his report there, he thought it was only necessary to do that when the torpedo was sighted. Clearly, potentially something that resulted in the loss of his ship. So that's it from the East Point. Nothing particularly remarkable there, but now I'm going to look at it from the perspective of the U48. Once again, we have lots of information from the archives, and as you can see there, the U48 was a very successful submarine. It sunk 20 ships in the last 6 months, and this was the second period of unrestricted warfare for submarines, where basically they were given free license to sink whatever ships they could find. The first period was in 1915 and came to a close when neutral ships, one of them was the Lusitania, I'm sure most people will have heard of, was sunk by submarines, and this caused a great outrage amongst neutral nations, and the Germans stopped doing it because they didn't want other people to come in against them in the war. 1917, the war wasn't going so well for them, and they had this belief that if they could sink enough shipping, then they could actually win the war doing that way. So they engaged in the second period of unrestricted warfare. They built up their submarine fleet. The U48 was a good example of that, and they were obviously going out to sink as many ships as they could. And the aim was to sink 600,000 tons per month. Now, actually, the 9th of March was already proving to be a good day for the U48. They'd sunk a small sailing vessel, the SV Abia, already that day. They'd used their gun, so they were happy with that. They'd saved a torpedo, and they then had another successful attack on the East Point. So they'd sunk a much larger ship, and that scan there is from the actual war diary of the U48. So they'd had this second successful attack, and they were actually, because there were other ships in the area, they were looking round for another target when disaster struck, really, for them. So there was 4 crew in the conning tower, which is what they needed to actually carry out a successful attack using this model of submarine. Now, that isn't a photo of the U48. That is a photo of another submarine, German submarine of the era, but gives you a kind of feel for what it must have been like inside one of those submarines. Now, as they were looking around for something else, the East Point actually collided with their submarine. They were at periscope depth. The East Point is sinking. The crew have got off, and smash! It knocks into the U48, and actually knocked unconscious 2 of the 4 people in the conning tower. You can see how that's easily done, because obviously there is lots of things around, isn't there? Lots of things you can bang your head on. The 2 crew who weren't knocked unconscious found that the conning tower was also leaking, so they needed to get out of the conning tower, and as quickly as they could, they got back into the rest of the submarine and closed a hatch. The submarine then crash dived to the bottom. Now, these submarines were difficult to actually control, and you can imagine, with having been hit by a massive ship, sprung a leak, desperate to get out of there. Clearly it was more difficult to control than normal, so they went down to the bottom 70 meters, well below their actual safe depth of 50 meters, but supposedly nothing else untoward happened, and eventually they managed to recover the submarine and get it back up to somewhere in the region of 40 to 50 meters, and all this is confirmed in their war diary. The bad news for them is that the 2 crew who were obviously left in the conning tower unconscious, both of them drowned, and one of those was actually the captain of the submarine, Captain Lieutenant Bernd Boos, and his navigator Adolf Bergman. Both of them drowned, and obviously that's a pretty poor end to what had been quite a promising day for them, I'm sure. So that's the story of what happened, how the East Point was sunk, what happened to the U48 in the imminent aftermath of sinking the East Point? So the next question is what happened to the U48, because it's now there. Its base Wilhelmshaven is there in sort of northern Germany, and clearly they need to get home. The guys on the submarine have got a submarine that's leaking. They've lost their captain and their navigator, and obviously they'd no doubt be pretty concerned about that. So the first thing they actually did was they buried their dead. And this is once again recorded in the war diary, including the latitude and longitude of where it happened. You can imagine that's a pretty somber experience. They also tried to patch up the conning tower, and they actually took it back down again and found that once they got to 20 meters, it flooded again. So pretty much diving the submarine is a bit of a challenge for them, and this causes them problems because obviously they need to get home, and that's the direct route, which is straight through the English Channel. And once again, that little map that I've got there is from their log, and it shows the route out that they took to get to where they sunk the East Point. Now, obviously, that takes them through the Straits of Dover, and the Straits of Dover was heavily protected with mines, ships, planes, all sorts of things. So clearly, going back that way was going to be very difficult for them, particularly as they couldn't dive, and so they took the decision that they would take the long route round. And once again, you can see there from their war diary that they went all the way round Ireland and actually round Shetland as well. Now, en route, bear in mind they're mainly on the surface. They did stop to sink another vessel, the sailing vessel Guerver, I think that's how you pronounce it, which was a 2,500 ton French ship. This they did using the gun on the submarine, and supposedly there was an exchange of gunfire. So there's a suggestion that the French ship fired back. Once again, that's I think testimony to the bravery of the crew. The idea that you've lost your captain, you've lost your navigator, you're in a submarine that's leaking, you're a long way from home, and yet still you've got the audacity and the bravery to start trading shots with a what they would have perceived as an enemy vessel. Anyway, they sunk it, and they then cracked on, and there's the rest of their journey. There was another minefield, lots more ships patrolling in the North Sea as well. They managed to avoid them all and got home on the 16th of March, which I think was a pretty impressive feat. Oh yeah, there you can see on the log, that's where the Guerver was sunk, marked on the log. So they got home, the submarine was repaired, they put to sea again, and they actually sank a further 14 ships from May 1917 under a new captain, mainly out there in the Atlantic, sort of to the south and west of the UK. Unfortunately for them, after one of these trips, when they were coming back in, they went aground on the infamous Goodwin Sands. They were doing a night transit, as you'd expect, went aground, couldn't get off the sand, couldn't dive, and the Navy, as you would imagine, spotted them pretty quickly, and so the actual U48 was destroyed on the 24th of November 1917. Now, the records are a bit uncertain, but approximately half the crew were killed and half were captured. And I'm told that the remains are still there, still on the Goodwin Sands, and they, as with all wrecks on the Goodwin Sands, they cover and uncover and can be seen at certain times. So pretty sad end to the U48, but from a British perspective, obviously good riddance, I'm sure. So that's the East Point. That's what happened to the U48, and I think a pretty incredible tale. You'll agree, an amazing, what these people went through at that particular time. Now, the other thing that caught my attention when I was doing the research into the East Point was this gentleman here, Harold James Young, who was the master of the East Point. Now, I think his grandson is listening in at the moment, Nick. He certainly was listening in when I last delivered this presentation, and Nick has given me an absolute treasure trove of information on his grandfather. So Master of the East Point, and the thing that I particularly noted about him is that he has got the DSC, the Distinguished Service Cross, and you can see he's got the ribbon there on his uniform. The Distinguished Service Cross was and is a naval medal. At that time, it was awarded to officers in the merchant fleet or naval officers below the rank of lieutenant commander. I've managed to find out. There we go. That's the supplement to the London Gazette, where medals were published at the time and still are to these days. And you can see there, they've got him there, and that's his citation, which frankly, compared to what they have to write these days to get a medal citation, is pretty brief. Although, you know, also I think to the point. And when you hear what he did, you'll find it something of an understatement as well. So one of the things that did make me slightly laugh, although I can imagine he didn't, is that they got his name wrong, and just shows that shocking staff work isn't just a feature of the modern day. So, question therefore is, I guess, where was the peninsula? What was the East Point and Harold Young doing there? So most people probably aware that the peninsula was is probably better known these days as Gallipoli, and the East Point was sent there in April 1915. So just under 2 years before it was sunk. It was requisitioned by the Admiralty, who needed, as you can imagine, lots of shipping at the time, and mainly what it was used to do was to transfer supplies, as you can see there, from the port of Kefalo into Suvla Bay, which is where the where one of the landings was. So it made many voyages backwards and forwards, taking all sorts of supplies there. And while it was doing one of those, it came under quite heavy shell fire. And you read the accounts of the day, and you read some of the letters that Nick has given me, and you'll find that they'd actually been under shell fire all day. And that picture in the right is actually of Suvla Bay. I'm not sure the East Point is in it. It's a kind of stock one, but you can see there the jetty where they'd have been unloading supplies. You can see the shell fire, and you can see that the barge on the right is clearly armoured. No doubt this was a kind of constant feature for them. So it received a shell at 14:40 hours, which set fire to the cargo of hay in the hold, and about 20 minutes later, another shell hit, fracturing a plate on the bow. So they were having quite a hard time. So obviously the ship's on fire. They're obviously firefighting as much as they can, and you can see there that's a report from an American newspaper, which obviously gives a bit more detail about it. But in order to get the fire out, what they had to do in the end was beach the ship just a bit to the north of Suvla Bay, which they did, and eventually, obviously, they continued to fight the fire. It was still alight at 7 o'clock the next day, so that is 12 odd hours of being alight, maybe more, 15 hours of being alight, and they only managed to get it under control by getting rid of all the cargo, throwing it all overboard, continuing to flood the vessel. Other vessels came alongside and used their pumps, and eventually they got it out at 10 o'clock the next day. So you now have this badly burnt vessel, and the challenge was to refloat her, which they did eventually, but it took them 2 days. They used tugs a couple of times, didn't work. They threw over more cargo, still didn't work, and the bow was jammed in a rock. It wasn't until the 3rd day when they actually got a naval cruiser and a tug and managed to pull her off and get her afloat. So you'd imagine, having been set on fire, having been beached, the bow hit by shells and also stuck into some rocks, tugged off, you'd imagine that would be the end of her Gallipoli campaign. But actually, it wasn't. Not only that, it wasn't the end of her troubles either, because a mere couple of days later, she was actually hit by that vessel there in a collision, the SS Bonvilston. Once again, more damage to the bow. but they needed ships, and they needed ships because they were planning to evacuate all the troops, which they did in December 1915. And the East Point was one of the vessels they used. It hadn't had any particularly major repairs, hadn't been to a dry dock. It was still used. And I think there's a letter there that Harold Young wrote to his sister, and I think it's worth just reading through. When you kind of, for me, when he talks about this wreck of a ship. He talks about the fact they had 400 blokes aboard, 55 life belts. The ship was in a sinking condition and the sea infested with submarines. And he then talks about the sons of barons and viscounts sleeping under cabin tables. So I think that gives a kind of feel for what that evacuation must be like. And obviously, the Gallipoli campaign is one of those things that will go down in history as a not a particularly successful military venture, apart from the evacuation is famously the one part of the campaign that went well. And the East Point, as you can see there, played a major part in taking 400 people off the beaches and getting them away to safety. So, an important part of the operation, I think. Now, slight segue, because every time I find out something about the East Point, I kind of I just take that second look. And one of the interesting things about the Bomvilston is that which is the ship that collided with it, is that it also hit another ship, but a month and a half later. And the one it hit was much bigger, 8,000-ton SS Geelong, and actually hit it so hard it sank it. Now, quite fortunate, because the Geelong had just disembarked over 1,300 Australian soldiers, and you can imagine if it had hit before that, then potentially we'd have had a very serious accident on our hands. But that didn't happen. The Bomvilston, you'll be pleased to know, got its just desserts in the end. It was torpedoed in 1918, probably much to the relief of all the other seafarers, and she now lies there just to the north of Stranraer. And I have to say, it's on my list of things to dive. I gather it's in about 60 meters. So anyway, we're going to leave the Bomvilston alone, and I'm going to go back to Harold Young. And the reason I want to go back to Harold Young is because he's a man who lived an incredible life, of which his part in Gallipoli and being sunk on the East Point are just one small part of it. And so I think it's fascinating to give you information I have. So he was born in 1880 in Stoke Newington. He went to sea age 16 and learnt his trade in sailing ships. This ship here is the Loch Truel, which was his second ship. His first ship, he got discharged after having an accident and hurt his hand that gave him a permanent injury. There he is. You can see him in the bottom photo. What's that? Nearly over 120 years ago, with his crew. And I don't know how well you can see them, but up close, that photo shows a very multicultural crew of clearly hardened sailors and all-round reprobates. I suspect, no doubt, a good lesson that he took with him for his continued life at sea. So he learnt his trade in sailing ships, worked his way up through the ranks, gaining the different certificates that you needed, and eventually he was appointed Master of the East Point. And that's the letter there, a reference, I guess. Once again, 1910, you can see that letter's from, so over 110 years old. After the East Point was sunk, his time aboard ships wasn't done. He went on to the SS Rapallo, which was a fairly new ship, same company, and was sailing that in the Mediterranean, in the Straits of Messina between Sicily and Italy, when that was torpedoed in 1918. So what's that? 9 months, just over 9 months after being torpedoed on the East Point. That letter is a letter from the British consulate, basically telling everybody to help him get back to the UK. Once again, an incredible piece of history that Nick Young has been able to give me. Now, sadly, on the Rapallo, there was a casualty, and the casualty was the assistant young Thomas Jenkins, 15 years old. His father had died, and his mother was left a widow and without one of her sons. And he is remembered on that thing there, which is the Tower Hill Memorial. I don't know if, for those of you who've been to London or have been to visit, incredibly somber place, and it's where all the merchant sailors and the sailors from the fishing fleet are remembered, and there's an awful lot of them. So Harold Young survived the Rapallo, got himself back, and carried on sailing in for the Furness line, various different ships. And his last ship, you can see him pictured there, was the MV Pacific Ranger. You can see him there, obviously looking as though he's enjoying life quite a bit. And he retired in mid-1940, obviously just after the start of the Second World War. And that proved to be actually a very sensible decision for him, because that ship was torpedoed mere months after he left it up there off the northwest coast of Ireland. And the crew, including his replacement, spent 9 days in lifeboats waiting to be rescued. And you can imagine, as he would have been then 60 years old, that would have been a pretty horrible place to be. So no doubt he was sat in front of his fire, thoroughly pleased with himself that he'd made the right decision. So this brave old sailor, after he retired, he took up a ceremonial post as the mayor deputy of one of the Cinque Ports towns. And once again, there's a nice newspaper clipping about it that I simply don't have space on my PowerPoint to give, but it was clear that he was held in high regard. And then he eventually passed away on the 26th of May 1967. And there's a lovely note there from the secretary of the Furness line. And I love the last line. It says, those of us who remain from these days hold his name in high regard. And I think that's a pretty nice epitaph. So there's the East Point, there's the U48, there's Harold Young, but the story of the East Point hasn't finished there, because one of the other things I knew about the East Point was that it was actually owned by somebody. It was owned by a member of our diving club. So Tony Hillgrove is relatively well known in these parts. Long-time diver, long-time collector of bits and pieces from the seabed. And as you can see there, he bought the wreck of the East Point in 1986. And for those of you who don't know, obviously ships, when they sink in wartime, are normally bought by the government from the insurers, and that was what happened with the East Point. So you're able to buy wrecks, and you probably still can, although I don't think it's so common these days. So Tony bought the wreck of the wreck of the East Point, and you might say, well, why would anybody buy a wreck that's 70 meters on the seabed? It's been down there, even at that time, it's been down there for 70 odd years. What would you do that for? Well, the reason is quite clear there. So I'm sure many people who dive in this area will know the SS Maine, which is shallower wreck, 30 odd meters, about half the size of the East Point. Well, her prop in 1962 sold for £840, which is, with inflation, about the equivalent of 15 grand now. So that's quite a lot of money if you can get it up from the seabed, and that is the Maine's prop being lifted there. So bronze props, other parts of wrecks are worth quite a lot of money. Now I've already shown you one picture of the prop on the East Point. That's another picture, not particularly great, I'm afraid. Flash photography doesn't work well with the kind of amount of stuff that you get in the water down there. So Tony bought it because he thought he would be able to lift the prop and make some money on it, out of it. Now, when I gave this presentation last time, I said I had no idea why that hadn't happened. Tony has since enlightened me, and the reason is because of that thing there. That's the Orion Star, which was a trawler based out of Newlyn down in Cornwall, and he had that all chartered, ready to come and lift the prop when, unfortunately, for Tony and for the Orion Star, she clearly had other sidelines going on, one of which was bringing cannabis resin in, and so the Orion Star was seized in in as it was at the time. That was in 1996, one of Britain's biggest ever drug seizures. So that's why that never happened. And we can all enjoy diving on a wreck that's still got the prop there. But one of the things about a wreck being owned is that he owns all of it, in the same way that people own cars and houses and all those kind of things. Tony does own that wreck. So that means he can give you permission to remove things from it. And with Tony's permission, I have removed that deck porthole there, brought it up to surface. And for those of you who doubt me, one of the things that you need to do if you lift anything off the seabed, I'm sure most people know, is declare it to the receiver of wreck. And there is the droit that I have confirming that I own that porthole. Now, the reason I lifted the porthole is because I'm always keen to do some education, and divers really enjoy looking at those kind of those bits and pieces. So in the centre where I work, I've cleaned up that porthole. I've put it on the wall, and I've put a bit of information there about the East Point, so that the divers who come through can hopefully read that and will know a bit more about the story of the East Point, which I hope you will agree is a story that deserves to be told and deserves to be an awful lot better known than it currently is. So there's a bit more of the modern history of the East Point. So what I'd just like to do is just to finish really with a bit of the kind of my takeaways from this, and some of the things that I've got out of it. And the first thing I'd like to say is the enjoyment that I've had in researching this kind of stuff. And I particularly like to thank Jane Maddocks, who I think is on this as well. Now, Jane has been to Kew, to the National Archive, a couple of times for me, poking through files that look like that, and she's dug out some of the information that I've shown you already. And it's fascinating when you get those first-hand accounts from the people at the time, to find out what they were doing. There's also that thing there, which you've seen already as well, which is the German equivalent. And I particularly like to thank my sister, who speaks German and has managed to translate a lot of that for me, which has been great for her. And the other thing, obviously, these days is clearly there's tons of information on the internet. So a combination of all those kind of things is has allowed me to kind of find all the information that I've given to you, and obviously the information that I've been given by Nick Young. Absolutely incredible amount of information, and I found him online on the internet discussing his grandfather on a First World War forum. So the other thing is obviously people who do technical diving. That's what your dive profiles look like. That is a dive profile. You can see you spend an awful lot of time doing that, and one of the things that's obviously pretty dull. One of the things that I'll be doing when I'm doing that in future on the East Point is I'll be thinking about these guys. Bernd Boos, who was obviously the captain of the U48. I'll be thinking about Harold Young, the incredible life he lived, of which the East Point is just one small part of it. I'll be thinking about young Thomas Jenkins, 15 years old, didn't get to enjoy much of his life very much, and all the other people remembered there on the Tower Hill Memorial. And I think one of the interesting things is Harold Young went to the unveiling of that, and I would imagine that when he was there, he was no doubt sort of thinking about lots of his friends, and hopefully young 15-year-old Jenkins as well. And I guess one of the last things I'll kind of take away is some of the great friendships I've had from diving the East Point, and particularly the gentleman in that photo will be known particularly to members of the club. He great friend of ours, former Royal Marine, former firefighter, all-round good egg. He very sadly died while diving the East Point last year, and obviously I'll be particularly remembering him when I dive next. And the last thing I'd like to say is just be careful to find anything that looks like that underwater. You never know where it's going to lead, and for me it's led to many hours of doing research into the East Point and the stories around it. So ladies and gentlemen, I'd like to thank you for your patience. I'd like you to thank you for coming. And if you've got any questions, can I ask you, probably the easiest thing to do is to type them into the chat window, and I can pick them up there. Or if you want to unmute your microphone and ask me, you're welcome to do that as well. But hopefully not everybody at once, otherwise it'll get a bit of a mess. Somebody else has asked, is interested in diving East Point. Is there a procedure to obtain permission to dive it? No, anybody can dive it. Obviously, it is owned by Tony, so you know, you shouldn't take things off it without him giving you a permit to do it, and obviously comply with all other regulations, etc. Boris has said he's looking forward to the next one. I have to say that's likely to take me a bit of a while to get all, all the information together. Although I am looking at the there is a series of wrecks in the local area called the Inner Patch. They're all part of the same convoy. 4 ships were sunk on the same night in 1942 in convoy PW 250, and I'm hoping to put their story together, because once again there is some fascinating stories. There's a British freighter, there's a Dutch freighter, there's a Danish freighter, and there is a Royal Navy armed trawler. All of them sunk on the same evening with quite a lot of loss of life. And so I'm hoping to put those together. And the armed trawler, the Ullswater, HM trawler Ullswater, is actually a protected wreck. So it's one of the new ones that's just been given that status.
Hi Dom, do you have any video footage of the dives itself?
I have to say I don't tend to take video. I tend to take stills. I think it's one of my, I've got a little bit of video of the East Point, but because I was videoing through my fisheye on the front of the camera, it tends to focus on the fisheye rather than focusing on the wreck. So it comes in and out of focus. It's really not very good, but it's something on my to-do list, is to try and get a bit of video.
Any photos would be appreciated.
Yeah, all the photos I've actually got are the ones that are in this presentation. Once this whole coronavirus thing goes away, I think all of us who've dived the East Point are keen on anything to get back out and dive it, because most of this information has come to light since we last dived it, and obviously it does make it much more special when you're diving, when you know these kind of stories.
It was a great presentation. Thank you very much.
No worries, it's a pleasure. So I've got a question from Graham there. There's a picture of a U-boat with a damaged conning tower. Was this a sub in the presentation? The photo, I think it does look as though it's a bit damaged, the conning tower, but I think that's actually the way it is. I don't know when those photos of the submarine were taken, but I would imagine just after it was built. So I don't think there's any photos of the actual damage. Right, guys, I don't think I'm getting any more questions. So unless anybody has got any more, I'm probably going to bring this to a close. If you do think of anything and you want to ask me, please Facebook me or whatever.